The room was quiet except for the soft sound of her breathing and the occasional creak of the old wooden bench beneath her. It was late afternoon, and the sun was casting long, golden shadows across the floor of the music school's practice room. She sat in front of the grand piano, a massive instrument that looked a bit too big for the small, dusty space. But to her, it felt like home. She had spent months preparing for the upcoming regional showcase, a big event that could open doors for her future. This was the kind of opportunity young musicians dreamed about, but right now, she just felt nervous. She placed her fingers on the cold keys and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the melody build up in her mind. Then, she began to play. The piece was a classic piano sonata, something the judges had heard 1,000 times before. Most students played it strictly by the book, hitting every note exactly as the composer intended. But as she played, something else happened. Her fingers seemed to have a mind of their own. She started to add small trills and deep, resonating chords that weren't written on the page. She changed the tempo in places, slowing down to make the music weep and then speeding up to make it dance. It wasn't just playing, it was storytelling. The music felt alive, swirling around the room with a complexity that was breathtaking. She was so lost in the sound that she didn't hear the door open behind her. She didn't see the tall figure step into the room or see the frown that formed on his face as he listened. It was her instructor, a man known for his strict discipline and his love for tradition. He stood there with his arms crossed, listening to the way she was twisting the original composition. When she reached the end of a phrase, he cleared his throat loudly. The sound cut through the music like a knife, and her hands jerked away from the keys. The sudden silence in the room was heavy. She turned around on the bench, her face flushing red when she saw who it was. "That was interesting," he said, walking slowly toward the piano. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it that made her stomach churn. "But I thought we agreed on what you were playing for the showcase." "We did," she stammered, clutching her skirt nervously. "I was just practicing, and I felt like the music needed more." "It does not need more," he said firmly. He reached out and tapped the sheet music sitting on the stand. "It needs precision. It needs simplicity. You have a natural talent, yes, but you are using it in the wrong way. You are trying to show off." She felt a spark of defiance inside her. "I wasn't trying to show off. I was trying to feel it. If I just play the notes on the page, it feels empty. It feels like I'm a robot." "Judges do not want feelings," he snapped. "They want to see that you can follow instructions. They want to see technique. When you add all those extra runs and complicated changes, you make yourself look sloppy. It looks like you cannot control the instrument." She looked down at her hands. She knew she could control the instrument. She had been playing since she was a little girl. Late at night, in her own home, she would play pieces that were far harder than this, pushing her fingers to their limit just to see what beautiful sounds she could create. But here, in this school, she was constantly told to hold back. She was told to be smaller, quieter, and simpler. "Listen to me," the instructor said, softening his voice a little. "I am telling you this for your own good. You go out there on that stage and try to perform like a virtuoso, and you are going to crash. If you miss one note in that complicated mess you were just playing, they will mark you down. But if you play it simple, clean, and perfect, you will be safe. Being safe is how you win." He leaned closer, looking her in the eyes. "Do not try to be a hero. Just keep it simple. Do you understand?" She bit her lip and nodded slowly. Yes, I understand. Good, he said, straightening his jacket. Practice it the way it is written. No extras. I will see you tomorrow. He turned and walked out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. She sat alone in the silence again, looking at the sheet music. The notes seemed to glare back at her, black and white symbols that felt like a cage. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the music stand across the room. How could he ask her to take all the color out of the painting? How could he ask her to speak without using her voice for the next hour? She tried to do exactly what he asked. She played the piece over and over again, strictly following the notes. It was perfect. There were no mistakes. But it was boring. Even she didn't want to listen to it. It felt hollow, like a shell with nothing inside. She stopped playing and rested her forehead on the cool wood of the piano. She thought about the audience. She thought about the judges sitting in the dark with their clipboards. She imagined them looking at her, expecting another boring student playing another boring song. And then she imagined surprising them. She imagined playing with all the skill and fire she actually possessed. The thought made her heart race. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the students walking on the path below. They were all talking and laughing, worried about exams and dates, unaware of the battle happening inside her chest. She knew her instructor was right about one thing: it was risky. If she went out there and played the complicated version, and she messed up, she would embarrass herself. She might even ruin her chances for a scholarship. But then, she remembered the feeling she had when she was improvising. That feeling of being truly free, of letting the music flow through her without fear. That was why she started playing in the first place. Not to please judges or to win trophies, but to create something beautiful. She turned back to the piano. She sat down and placed her hands on the keys one last time. She didn't look at the sheet music. She closed her eyes and let her hands drop. The sound that filled the room was complex, rich, and powerful. It was the opposite of simple. It was risky, wild, and full of emotion. She played until her fingers were tired, knowing deep down that when she walked onto that stage in 2 days, she wouldn't be able to hold back. She was going to show them everything she had, no matter what they said. The decision was made, and for the first time all day, she wasn't scared anymore. She was ready. The morning of the big showcase arrived with a gray, drizzling rain that tapped relentlessly against the window pane. It wasn't the bright, sunny day she had hoped for, but in a way, the gloomy weather fit her mood. Her stomach felt like it was tied in a giant knot, and no matter how much deep breathing she tried, the butterflies wouldn't settle down. She stood in front of the mirror in her small room, staring at her reflection. Today was the day she had been working toward for months, yet she felt more like she was walking toward a cliff edge than a stage. Getting ready was a blur. She put on her best outfit, a simple dark dress that her mother had helped her iron the night before. It was modest and clean, exactly the kind of outfit that said, "I am here to work, not to show off." As she brushed her hair, she thought about her instructor's warnings ringing in her ears. Keep it simple. Don't be a hero. Every time she picked up her bag to leave the house, a wave of doubt crashed over her. Was she being foolish? Was she about to throw away a huge opportunity just because of her ego? The fear of failure was heavy, clutching at her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her family was in the kitchen, wishing her luck. Her father poured her a glass of juice and gave her a reassuring hug. He didn't know much about classical music or piano competitions. To him, she was already a winner just for being chosen to perform. His simple, Unquestioning support made her want to cry. She forced a smile, nodded at them, and grabbed her umbrella. "I'll be back later," she said, trying to sound confident, but her voice wavered just a little bit. The drive to the city center felt longer than usual. The rain blurred the lines on the road, and the wipers on the bus swished back and forth like a metronome set to a slow, anxious tempo. She clutched her music folder tightly against her chest, even though she barely needed to look at the sheets anymore. She watched the city go by, the gray buildings, the people rushing to work with their own umbrellas, and wondered if they were as nervous as she was. She felt small in the big city, just a tiny drop in a massive ocean. When the bus finally pulled up to the Performing Arts Center, the building loomed large and imposing. It was made of stone and glass, looking more like a fortress than a place for art. She stepped off the bus, joining a stream of other musicians who were also making their way inside. Some of them looked calm, chatting with their friends or scrolling through their phones. Others looked pale and silent, staring at the ground. Seeing them didn't make her feel better, it just reminded her of how many people were competing for the same attention. Inside the lobby, the air was cool and smelled faintly of floor wax and old dust. The chatter of hundreds of voices echoed off the high ceilings, creating a constant buzz of noise. She walked over to the registration desk to sign in, exchanging her ID card for a numbered badge. She pinned it to her dress, feeling like it was a target on her back. She was contestant number 42. Just a number in a long list of hopefuls. She found a quiet corner in the waiting area and sat down. Around her, students were frantically reviewing their music, their fingers silently tapping on their knees or the armrests of chairs. One boy was humming a violin tune so loudly that people nearby were starting to get annoyed. She closed her eyes and blocked it all out. She tried to visualize herself on the stage, but the image in her mind kept changing. Sometimes she saw herself playing perfectly, with the crowd clapping. Other times, she saw her fingers slipping, hitting the wrong keys, and the hall filling with silence. Her instructor arrived about an hour before the show was set to begin. He walked through the crowd with a confident stride, greeting other teachers and nodding at his students. When he finally reached her corner, she felt her muscles tense up. He looked sharp and professional, holding a cup of coffee. "You are early," he said, looking down at her. "Good. Are you ready?" She nodded, but she couldn't look him in the eye. "I think so." "Remember what I told you," he said, his voice dropping to a lower, more serious tone. He leaned in closer so that only she could hear. "The judges have seen hundreds of these pieces. They are tired. They are bored. If you play exactly what is on the page, clean and simple, they will appreciate the respect you show for the music. Do not try to add your own flavor today. That is not what this competition is about." "I remember," she whispered. "Good girl," he said, straightening up. "I have to go speak with the organizer. Go warm up your fingers, but don't tire yourself out." He walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts again. She watched him disappear into the crowd and felt a pang of guilt. He had taught her so much. He had given her his time and expertise. By planning to ignore his advice, she felt like she was betraying him. But the feeling of betrayal didn't stop the burning desire in her hands. They wanted to move. They wanted to create. Soon, it was time for the performers to move backstage. A stern-looking woman with a clipboard ushered them through a heavy velvet curtain. The atmosphere changed instantly. The chatter stopped, the air felt thinner and colder. This was the backstage area, a maze of narrow hallways and cables. The smell of sawdust and dust was stronger here. She found her place in the line. She was near the middle, which was actually a relief. Being first would have been terrifying, but waiting until the very end would have been torture. Standing in line, she could hear the muffled sounds of the performances happening on the other side of the curtain. Occasionally, a loud round of applause would break through, signaling that someone had finished well. As the line moved forward, she peeked through a small gap in the heavy curtain. The auditorium was huge. Row after row of red seats stretched back into the darkness. In the center of the stage, a single spotlight shone down on the grand piano, making it look like it was glowing. It was a beautiful instrument, much larger and more polished than the one she practiced on at school. From where she stood, she could see the current performer, a young man playing a violin. He was playing very fast, and his face was scrunched up in concentration. He looked incredibly stiff, like a robot trying to move at high speed. When he finished, there was a polite, but unenthusiastic applause. He walked off stage, looking exhausted. He passed her in the hallway, sweating and out of breath. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. Seeing him made her realize something important. Everyone was terrified. Everyone was trying so hard to be perfect that they were forgetting to be human. They were all playing it safe, just like she was told to do. They were all trying to give the judges exactly what they thought they wanted. Finally, the person in front of her went on stage. It was a young girl with curly hair who looked so nervous she might faint. She walked to the piano, sat down, and played a very basic, simple song. She played it well, with no mistakes, but it was forgettable. It was like elevator music. The audience clapped politely, and the girl rushed off the stage, looking relieved just to be done. And next, the stage manager whispered to her, "Is number 42." Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. There was no turning back. She took a deep breath, wiped her sweaty palms on her dress, and stepped out from the safety of the curtain. The walk from the darkness of the wings to the bright spotlight felt like the longest walk of her life. She could feel the heat of the lights on her face, and she could sense the hundreds of eyes watching her every step. She reached the piano. The wood gleamed under the harsh light. She sat down on the bench and adjusted the height. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavy and expectant. She looked out at the audience, but the lights were too bright to see any faces clearly. She saw only a vague mass of darkness. They were waiting. They were expecting another student. They were expecting simple. She placed her sheet music on the rack, just for show. She didn't need to look at it. She sat up straight, closed her eyes for a split second to find her center, and placed her fingers lightly on the keys. In that moment, the fear didn't go away, but it changed. It turned into a sharp focus. She wasn't there to please her instructor, and she wasn't there to just get a score. She was there to play. She opened her eyes, took a breath, and began. The first few notes that floated into the massive hall were exactly what everyone expected. They were clean, precise, and polite. Her fingers moved across the ivory keys with the careful discipline of a student who had memorized every single mark on the page. The melody was gentle, a familiar tune that the judges had likely heard dozens of times that day alone. In the wings, her instructor watched with a satisfied nod, his arms crossed, believing his advice had been followed. The audience, many of whom were glancing at their programs or whispering to their neighbors, settled in for what they thought would be a standard, forgettable performance. For the first minute, she did exactly what she was told. She kept it simple. She played the notes exactly as the composer had written them hundreds of years ago. But as she moved through the first section, she felt a strange hollowness in the sound. It felt like she was reading a dictionary aloud instead of reading a beautiful poem. The words were there, but the soul was missing. Her hands felt heavy, restrained by the invisible chains of the instructions she had been given. She looked at the music stand, but the black dots on the page seemed to blur together. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. It happened during a brief pause in the melody, a moment where the music was supposed to breathe before moving on. Instead of returning to the written notes, her left hand drifted down the keyboard. It struck a deep, resonating bass chord that wasn't on the sheet music. The sound was dark and rich, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the bench where she sat. It was a sound that demanded attention. In the wings, her instructor's head snapped up. His eyes widened. He uncrossed his arms and took a step forward toward the curtain, as if he wanted to rush out and stop her. But he was too late. Following that deep bass note, her right hand began to move. It didn't go back to the simple melody. Instead, it launched into a flurry of fast, intricate notes that spun around the original tune like a vine climbing a tree. She was improvising now. She was taking the simple skeleton of the song and fleshing it out with muscle, skin, and heart. The pace quickened. What was supposed to be a slow, thoughtful walk turned into a sprint. The change in the atmosphere was instant. The low murmuring in the audience died out completely. People who were looking at their phones suddenly lowered them. A man in the third row who had been dozing off sat up straight. The sound coming from the stage was no longer polite background noise, it was a living, breathing entity that filled every corner of the hall. She played with an intensity that startled everyone. Her posture changed. She was no longer the timid girl trying to be small and invisible. She leaned into the piano, attacking the keys with a mix of aggression and grace. Her fingers moved with a blur of motion, finding patterns and rhythms that were complex and daring. She was adding layers of sound that defied the simple structure of the piece. It was risky, so risky. One wrong move in the speed and complexity could have ruined the whole thing, but she didn't falter. The music began to swell. She was playing chords with her left hand that spanned an incredible distance, while her right hand danced delicately but powerfully in the higher registers. The contrast was stunning. The music would thunder like a storm, loud enough to vibrate the seats, and then in a split second, it would drop to a whisper, soft and fragile as a falling leaf. She was taking the audience on a roller coaster they hadn't bought tickets for. The judges, a panel of stern-faced experts who had been scribbling lazily on their clipboards, stopped writing. They all looked up at the stage, their expressions shifting from boredom to shock. One of the judges adjusted his glasses, squinting at the pianist as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. They exchanged glances with one another. This wasn't in the criteria. This wasn't the safe performance they were used to grading. It was wild, but it was undeniable. Backstage, the instructor stood frozen. His face was a mix of horror and confusion. He saw his student ignoring his direct orders. He saw her taking the dangerous path he had warned her against. He waited for the mistake. He waited for her hands to get tangled, for the music to fall apart. He wanted to be right. He wanted to be the one to say, "I told you so." But as the seconds ticked by, the mistake never came. Instead, the music just got better. She was lost in it now. She couldn't see the audience anymore, she couldn't even see the piano. She was operating on pure instinct. The hours she had spent practicing in secret, the late nights where she allowed herself to explore the full potential of the instrument, were all pouring out of her in this moment. She wasn't thinking about the notes. She was thinking about the feeling. She was channeling all her nervousness, all her doubt, and all her desire to be heard into the keys. The complexity of the piece grew. She began to weave in melodies from other songs, subtle references that only a trained ear would catch. She turned the simple tune into a tapestry of sound. It was technically difficult, the kind of playing that usually took years of professional experience to master. Yet here she was, a student, executing it with a confidence that looked effortless. The sound of the piano was so different now. It wasn't just a hammer hitting strings. It was singing. The high notes sparkled like crystals, and the low notes growled like a beast awakening. The acoustics of the hall, which usually made quiet music sound thin, were now carrying her sound to the very back row. A young child sitting in the balcony, who had been fidgeting restlessly, stopped moving and stared down at the stage, mouth open in amazement. She played a series of running notes down the scale, so fast that they sounded like a waterfall cascading over rocks. It was a dazzling display of skill that required absolute control. Just as the audience thought she might lose control, she slammed on the brakes, bringing the music back to that original, simple melody. But it wasn't the same anymore. The context had changed. The simple notes now felt heavy with meaning because of what she had just put them through. They felt like a survivor emerging from a storm. The pivot was complete. She had successfully transformed a boring assignment into a masterpiece of improvisation. She had taken the advice to keep it simple and shattered it into 1,000 pieces, using those pieces to build something entirely new. The air in the room felt electric. No one was breathing. No one was moving. Every single person in that auditorium was captivated, held hostage by the sound of a girl who refused to be invisible. She had shown them her cards, and they were a royal flush. The simple girl on the bench was gone, replaced by a musician of raw, terrifying power. The music was no longer just a sound, it was a physical force that seemed to push against the walls of the auditorium. As she moved deeper into the piece, the complexity grew. Her hands were doing things that seemed impossible for a human being to do. Her left hand was jumping across the lower keys, creating a thick, driving rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, while her right hand was spinning out melodies that were incredibly fast and intricate. Anyone who knew anything about the piano could see that what she was doing was dangerous. She was walking a tightrope without a safety net. If she had been reading the music, she would have had a map to follow. But she had thrown the map away. She was navigating by pure instinct. The audience watched with a mix of fear and amazement. It was like watching a race car driver take a sharp corner at top speed. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the crash, but she just kept going faster. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. Just a few minutes ago, the hall was filled with the restless energy of people who were bored and waiting for the event to be over. Now, there was a tension that crackled in the air like electricity. It was so quiet that you could hear the soft squeak of the piano pedal as she pressed it down. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when a large group of people is completely captivated by what they are seeing and hearing. They weren't just listening to a song, they were witnessing a moment of raw, unfiltered talent. High up in the balcony, a young boy who had been kicking the back of the seat in front of him stopped moving. He stared down at the stage, his eyes wide. Even someone who didn't understand classical music could tell that this was different. There was an energy coming from the stage that you couldn't ignore. The music was telling a story without using a single word. It went through moments of anger, crashing down like thunder, and then it would soften into something so sad and gentle that it made people's hearts ache. The instructor stood in the shadows of the wings. His face had gone pale. He watched her hands, his mouth slightly open. He had been teaching for decades, and he had seen thousands of students play the piano. He knew exactly how hard the piece she was playing actually was. But she wasn't playing the standard version. She was playing a version that required a level of skill and musical understanding that most professional musicians spent a lifetime trying to achieve. He realized, with a sudden jolt, that he had been wrong. He hadn't just underestimated her ability, he had completely misunderstood who she was. He saw now that his advice to keep it simple was actually holding her back. It was like putting a leash on a cheetah. He felt a strange mix of shame and pride. He wanted her to stop because it was reckless, but another part of him was marveling at the sheer beauty of the rebellion. The judges were reacting, too. The panel, which had been so stern and uninterested just moments before, was now fully alert. One judge, an older man with gray hair who had been looking at his watch for the last few performances, was now leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He had taken his glasses off to rub his eyes, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He exchanged a look with the judge sitting next to him, a woman with a sharp face. She didn't say anything, but she simply nodded slowly. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. They were not judging a student anymore, they were witnessing the arrival of an artist. On stage, sweat was beginning to gather on her forehead. Her arms were starting to ache from the effort. The physical demand of playing at this intensity was exhausting. But she didn't slow down. Instead of getting tired, the fatigue seemed to feed her emotions. She poured her own struggles, her own need to be heard, into the keys. The music became even more intense. It swelled and grew, filling every inch of the huge hall. The sound was so big that it seemed to vibrate in the chests of the audience members. They weren't just hearing the music, they were feeling it. She began a section that was incredibly technical. Her fingers were a blur, moving so fast that individual notes were blending into a long, flowing river of sound. It was the kind of passage that usually terrifies pianists because if you lose your focus for even a split second, the whole thing falls apart. But she was in a trance. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly back. She wasn't thinking about her fingers or the notes. She was letting the music take her where it wanted to go. The audience was mesmerized. A young woman in the front row, who had been checking her phone nervously when the performance started, had put her phone away without even looking at it. She was sitting on the edge of her seat, her hands clasped together tightly under her chin. People who had come to the showcase just to support their own children were now ignoring their own programs, completely drawn to the girl at the piano. It was as if the rest of the world had disappeared, and the only thing that existed was this one girl and this one instrument. The complexity of the piece reached its peak. The sound was a storm, chaotic yet perfectly controlled. It was loud and powerful, like waves crashing against a cliff during a storm. The heavy bass notes shook the floor, and the high notes cut through the air like knives. Then, as suddenly as the storm had begun, it started to break. She began to pull the music back. The chaotic roar softened. The fast run slowed down. She brought the complexity back to the simple melody she had started with. But now, that simple melody meant something completely different. It wasn't just a nice tune anymore. It felt like a survivor coming out of the wreckage. It felt wise and tired but hopeful. The contrast between the wild complexity she had just played and the simple notes she was playing now was heartbreaking. She played the final phrases with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of some of the audience members. She wasn't showing off anymore. She was whispering a secret to the room. Every person there leaned in to listen. The silence was absolute. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. They were afraid that if they made a sound, the magic would be broken. She reached the very last note. It was a single, low note that she held down, letting the sound ring out and slowly fade into the air. She sat there, her hands still on the keys, letting the vibration of the piano die away naturally. The sound hung in the air for what felt like a lifetime, a ghost of the beautiful storm that had just passed through the room. Her chest was heaving, and she opened her eyes, slowly coming back to reality. She didn't move. She just sat there, waiting for the silence to end. The silence that followed the final fading note was heavy, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that happens when everyone in the room is holding their breath, afraid that if they let it out, the magic they just witnessed might disappear. The sound of the piano had completely dissolved into the air, but the feeling it left behind hung like a thick cloud over the auditorium. The young woman sat frozen on the bench, her hands still resting lightly on the keys, her eyes closed. She was trying to slow her heart down, which was beating so hard she could feel it thumping against her ribs. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The judges did not pick up their pens. The audience did not shift in their seats. It was as if time had stopped inside the concert hall. The contrast between what they expected a simple, safe student recital and what they received a storm of raw emotion and technical brilliance was too great for them to process immediately. Then, the spell broke. It didn't start with a slow clap or a polite cough. It started with a shout from the back of the room, a loud bravo. That shattered the quiet. Suddenly, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was a roar. People jumped to their feet in a single wave. The sound was deafening, a chaotic mix of clapping, cheering, and whistling that bounced off the high ceilings and walls. The young woman on stage opened her eyes, blinking in the bright spotlight. She looked out toward the darkness where the audience sat, her face pale and flushed with exertion. She saw the young boy in the balcony clapping his hands above his head, jumping up and down with excitement. She saw the woman in the front row wiping tears from her eyes with a tissue while clapping enthusiastically. Every single person was on their feet. It was a standing ovation. It was the kind of reaction usually reserved for famous concert pianists, not for a student playing in a regional showcase. The shock of the noise washed over her. For months, she had been told to be quiet, to be small, and to blend in. She had been trained to fear making mistakes, to fear doing too much. But here she was, having done the exact opposite, and the world wasn't angry at her. The world was cheering for her. Slowly, shakily, she stood up. She felt a little dizzy, probably from the adrenaline and the intensity of the performance. She turned to face the audience and bowed deeply. It wasn't a practiced, elegant bow like the ones the other students did. It was a genuine bow, filled with gratitude and relief. When she straightened up, she saw the judges. They were all standing, too. Even the oldest, strictest judge was clapping slowly with a look of deep respect on his face. He gave her a nod that said more than any score on a sheet of paper ever could. She didn't need to see her score to know she had won. Backstage, the atmosphere was even more frantic. The instructor stood near the curtain, his face pale and his mouth hanging open. He had been ready to run onto the stage and stop her when she first started to improvise. He had been ready to apologize to the judges and scold her for being reckless. But as the music grew, he had stopped. He had stood there, just like everyone else, captured by the sound. Now, hearing the thunderous applause from the audience, he felt a strange mix of emotions. He felt foolish. He realized he had been trying to put a bird in a cage. He had tried to trim her wings because he was afraid she might fly too high and fall. But she didn't fall. She soared. He wiped a hand over his face, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He realized he had been wrong. Not just a little bit wrong, but completely and utterly wrong. The student who he thought was merely good was actually extraordinary. She walked off the stage, her legs feeling like jelly. As soon as she stepped into the darker, cooler wings, the other students rushed toward her. They were no longer looking at her with polite indifference or jealousy. They were looking at her with awe. A girl who had played before her, a violinist who had been very nervous, grabbed her arm. "That was incredible," the violinist whispered, her eyes wide. "I have never heard anything like that." Another student patted her on the back, grinning from ear to ear. "You showed them, didn't you?" he said. She smiled at them, but she felt exhausted. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving her feeling weak but incredibly light. She looked up and saw her instructor walking toward her. For a second, her old fear came back. She braced herself for a lecture. She expected him to say, "You got lucky," or "That was too risky." He stopped in front of her. The noise from the auditorium was still loud, filtering in through the heavy curtains. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. He didn't look angry. He looked transformed. I don't know what to say," he said softly. He reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. "I told you to keep it simple. I told you to be safe. I was wrong." She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "I just couldn't play it the other way," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. It felt like lying. "You didn't lie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You told the truth. And it was beautiful. Never let anyone tell you to keep it simple again." He pulled her into a hug, something he had never done before. It was a clumsy hug, awkward and stiff, but it meant the world to her. In that moment, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She didn't just have the approval of the crowd, she had the respect of the one person she feared disappointing. After changing out of her performance clothes and gathering her things, she walked out of the Performing Arts Center. The rain had stopped while she was inside, and the clouds were breaking up. Patches of blue sky were showing through, and the wet pavement was reflecting the street lights. The air smelled fresh and clean, like a new beginning. She didn't take the bus right away. She wanted to walk for a bit. She needed to process what had just happened. As she walked down the street, she thought about the lesson she had learned. It wasn't just about piano music. It was about life. Everyone is always told to fit in, to follow the rules, and to take the safe path. People are told that being different is dangerous and that keeping things simple is the best way to avoid failure. But she realized that if you always keep it simple, you never find out what you are truly capable of. You might avoid making mistakes, but you also avoid creating something amazing. By risking everything, by refusing to keep it simple, she had found her true voice. She had learned that her skills were not meant to be hidden away or dumbed down for other people's comfort. They were meant to be shared in their full, messy, complicated glory. She passed a shop window with a television display in it. On the screen, they were showing highlights of the evening. She saw herself for a split second, walking onto the stage. She stopped and watched. She didn't see a scared girl anymore. She saw a musician. A few people walked by, recognizing her. That was quite a show, a man passing by said, tipping his hat to her. She smiled and thanked him. She didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt like she had finally stepped into the light. She reached the bus stop and sat down on the metal bench. She hugged her sheet music folder to her chest. Inside were the notes for the simple version of the song. She smiled, thinking that she would probably never play that version again. She would keep the music as a souvenir, a reminder of the day she stopped listening to the voice of fear and started listening to the music in her heart. When the bus pulled up, she climbed aboard and found a seat. She looked out the window as the city lights started to blur by. She was tired, her fingers were sore, and she knew she would probably sleep for 12 hours when she got home. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't worried about the future. She knew the road would be difficult. She knew not everyone would understand her style or her choices. But that didn't matter anymore. She had proved to herself, to her instructor, and to the world that she was more than just a student following instructions. She was an artist. And her skills, the skills that did the opposite of keeping it simple, would take her wherever she wanted to go. The bus rumbled on, carrying her toward the rest of her life, and she closed her eyes, listening to the echo of the applause that still rang in her ears.